Okay, well, it's now 1 o'clock, so I think I should kick off. My name is Simon Eliot. I'm Professor of History of the Book here in the Institute of English Studies, which is part of the School of Advanced Study, which is based in Senate House. I'm going to talk briefly on publishing and propaganda in World War II, though, as you will see from my title, the time available has required me to narrow the field of view to essentially printed materials aimed at audiences abroad. However, I have been asked by the organisers of Being Human to read the following statement before I begin. Appropriately style of Ministry of Information, that is what I am going to do. The event is part of the launch day of Being Human, UK's first National Festival of Humanities. This new national festival is led by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. It aims to demonstrate vitality, vibrancy and relevance to the humanities through a national programme that demonstrates how the humanities shape our everyday lives. All the events taking place in the Senate House today have been coordinated by the School of Advanced Study and explore what it means to be human in a digital age of too much information! Exclamation mark. Indeed, I think not too much information, but too many exclamation marks. There are actually 3 in these 2 paragraphs. Don't forget it says that there are events taking place right across the country over the next week from the 15th to the 23rd of September. And I'm asked to remind you that we really welcome feedback, and there are various feedback forms available, and I gather there are roving interviewers around, so be warned you may get interviewed for your own particular views. Okay, let's begin. I must apologise immediately to those who've been on Henry's tour, because I'm going to start with a more general introduction to the Ministry of Information for the benefit of those who haven't yet been on the tour. But I will then get into the main subject of this lecture within 2 or 3 minutes. Now, the Institute of English Studies has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to undertake a 4-year research programme on the communication history of the Ministry of Information between 1939 and 1946, when it was closed down. We only started at the beginning of this year, and as I imagine you can appreciate, we have much to do. So please regard this talk as an interim report from the front, or rather from a very small sector of one of the fronts. One of the features of this project is that it is being undertaken in the very building, Senate House, in which the Ministry of Information operated throughout the Second World War. And just to remind you, if you're not very aware, this is the building we're in. I will begin this paper with a quotation from Evelyn Waugh's Put Out More Flags, which was published in 1942. He crossed Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street, walking without any particular object except to take the air. It was not until he was under its shadow and saw the vast bulk of London University insulting the autumnal sky that he remembered that here was the Ministry of Information, and that his publisher, Mr. Geoffrey Bentley, was working there at the head of some newly formed department. This is a picture of Senate House under construction in the mid-1930s, and a watercolour as it was in roughly 1943. The MOI was responsible for communicating news and views about the conduct of the war, not only to the British people, but also more generally to the world. That is, to those nations in the Empire, to allied countries, to friendly nations, and to all those countries that remained neutral. It was also responsible for relations with the UK newspapers and for censorship. It conducted this global mission not only through print of a variety of sorts, but also by means of radio broadcasts, mostly by the BBC, through photographs, films, and static and travelling exhibitions. During the early years of the war, it employed loudspeaker bands to tour bombed areas, to give information about where and how to to gain emergency shelter, food, clothing, and where, of course, to register deaths. It also had at least one full-time lecturer, Bernard Newman, the great-nephew of George Eliot, who toured the country by train and by bicycle, which he called very appropriately George, giving talks in factory canteens and village halls about the war effort and its progress, to audiences ranging from 200 to 1,500 at a time. The MOI was, in other words, an extraordinarily large active centre for the transport and transmission of information, using all the means of mass communication then available to it. But it wasn't just about sending information out. By mid-1940, it had developed its own home intelligence unit, which used many of the techniques of mass observation to survey public opinion throughout the UK. This feedback was conveyed in extensive weekly reports, produced until the end of 1944, reports which were read intently by MOI's staff, responsible for monitoring the country's morale and identifying things that might negatively affect it, such as rumour. This is the subject my colleague Dr. Henry Irving will be talking about later on this afternoon. In other words, the MOI was a communication system which, unlike most other contemporary publishers and communicators, had a rapid feedback loop which would have alerted it to its successes and its failures, and required the MOI, often within a few weeks, to change a given public relations strategy. Now, the MOI was a complicated organisation which combined politicians, civil servants, and a remarkable ragbag of writers, producers, filmmakers, journalists, advertising men. Some brought in on a temporary basis, others semi-permanent. Few other organisations could have contained and used, effectively for the most part, such a diverse range of people that included Cecil Beaton, Nicholas Bentley, John Betjeman, and indeed Joan Hunter-Dunn, Brendan Bracken, Sir Kenneth Clarke, Duff Cooper, Nancy Cunard, Elizabeth David, Arthur Koestler, Cecil Day-Lewis, Paul Nash, Laurence Olivier, Mervyn Peake, Nicholas Pevsner, Lord Reith, Neville Shute, and Dylan Thomas. In the time allotted, I'm not going to attempt any more by way of a general introduction to the MOI. This afternoon, I'm just going to concentrate on one aspect of the MOI's output, that of print production. And even within this limited area, I'm going to consider only the extraordinary range of impressive books and posters produced not for the home market, but for abroad. So I'm in a sense going to preclude some most striking and obvious productions, many of which you'll be able to see in the exhibition on the floor above us. Such pamphlets, for instance, as The Battle of Britain, produced pretty rapidly after the event. One of the things that should impress you immediately is the striking graphic design of many of these publications. Battle of Britain, East of Malta, West of Suez, and Bomber Command. Again, another quite striking graphic. The graphic design, in fact, was carried over onto the back as well. So it's a single striking picture of a bomber raid, it's like a Wellington, over Germany. But there are also posters, again, directed at the domestic market. There was the Let Us Go Forward Together, a sequence of comic cartoons, generally labelled Careless Talk Costs Lives, two women chatting away, and just behind them, Hitler and Goering listening intently. Waste paper to munitions of war. There was an astonishingly elaborate and, on the whole, successful campaign for recycling and reclamation, of which this was a part. And the inevitable dig for victory, for their sake. Grow your own vegetables, and behind the spade and the man's leg are the children he's, as it were, going to feed through his efforts. It's easy to appreciate the strong graphic nature of the posters. It's less easy to get a sense of their scale and their ubiquitousness. But fortunately, we have a number of photographs, one of which is this, taken in the early 40s, of an area you see partly bombed, with an astonishing sequence of no fewer than 6 very large posters, one of which, in fact, if I can bring it there, is the Dig for Victory poster. I think one gets a sense from photographs like this, and the sort of intrusiveness, the very strong, large-scale message that these posters were conveying, one gets a sense of where 1984 came from. If you think of Orwell's vision, it is a vision of constant communication, of the state endlessly intruding, of posters and pictures thrusting almost down your throat the message, and a sense of bleakness too. Victory is significant. If anyone remembers the early chapters of 1984, the hero lives in Victory mansions and he smokes Victory cigarettes. The echo of the sorts of campaigns launched and perpetuated in the early 40s echo on in Orwell's prose. Anyone who's undertaken work on publishers or printers in competent countries in wartime, particularly in World War II, would have been struck by the problems of paper supply. In the UK, paper was severely rationed at the beginning of the war, and as supplies, such as those from Norway, became unavailable after the German invasion, that ration was reduced year by year. If, as a publisher, you had a title which was regarded as helpful to the war effort, or morale boosting, such as a Penguin Special, or an edition War and Peace, once Russia had been invaded and became an ally of ours, then you might hope for an additional supply from the Mobley Pool, which is a quantity of paper that could be released by the government to good causes. Otherwise, you could sell all you could print, but you could print relatively little on a very restricted supply. I had been aware that these restrictions were not a constraint on much government printing. During the Second World War, for instance, Oxford University's printing capacity was to a very large extent taken over by the government, and the press had so many orders for geographical handbooks and top-secret code books that it had to farm work out to some 70 other printing firms throughout the UK, including Cambridge University Press. Nevertheless, even with that knowledge, the quantity and scope of the printing undertaken for the MOI, particularly by HMSO, just for its market abroad, was quite astonishing. Let me illustrate this with a couple of examples. From 1941, the MOI was printing at least 2 monthly magazines for international consumption. War in Pictures, which had a print run of between 450 to 500,000 copies a month. And Neptune, a magazine focusing on the activities of the British Armed Services and their allies, and which was commonly printed in editions of between 700,000 and 800,000 copies a month, with the encouragement to read it and then pass it on as a way of ensuring maximum circulation. But it was not just the monthly print runs that were impressive, it was also their distribution pattern. Quite commonly, both magazines would be distributed to more than 50 countries, areas, and markets each month. An extraordinary logistical achievement in the midst of a world war. I didn't expect you to read that, but this is a list of the countries and areas to which Neptune was distributed. This particular edition of Neptune was sent to, among other places, Canada, Australia, Southern Rhodesia, Barbados, Ceylon, St. Helena, India, Panama, Mexico, Congo, and printed in English, French, and Spanish editions. Numbers might be small in certain narrow markets, such as St. Helena, but they were always supplied month after month. In all, this particular issue was distributed to 83 countries and areas. 9,000 copies to India, 25,000 to the USA, 400 to Afghanistan in French, 75 to the New Hebrides, and 80 copies to St. Helena. As with many of the products for the UK market, these journals sent abroad use strikingly modern graphic design to maximise impact. These were not printed products as designed by staid senior civil servants who had been educated in the Victorian or Edwardian period. In these popular publications, images were as important as text, and photographs and graphic art were used extensively, often spread over more than one page and frequently bled over the margins to the very edge of the page. The impact of the graphic design revolution of the 1920s and 30s was evident in almost every publication, and not only in terms of the effective use of photography, but also in the way in which standardized icons were used to represent statistics, a process which showed the influence of Otto Murat's work on isotype in Vienna. Murat was forced out of Austria by the arrival of the Nazis, and he finally settled after a period of internment in Oxford, where he established the Isotype Institute. Here are a set of postcards printed for MOI, which illustrate the techniques of presenting complicated statistical information in a visually, immediately understandable way, such as the quantity of enemy ships sunk in relation to the quantity of Allied ships sunk. Postcards, interestingly enough, were extensively printed and distributed, and not only convey information, but also excitement and adventure through vivid pictorial representations. There are three which are clearly designed to capture the imagination and excite the mind. You'll notice that this sort of graphic art is remarkably reminiscent of the sort of graphic presentations visible in American comics of the 1920s and 30s, and were to be evident in British comics from now on. The comics of the interwar period also had a readily identifiable impact on some of the more popular magazine publications, such as another magazine called Flag, which again was published in a number of languages. Here's a front page of that magazine, the flag of victory, presented in vivid colours. And the interiors, the open spreads, were equally impressive, daring exploits of British submarine. Vivid diagrammatic images, such as cutaway drawings, were also extensively used to explain the technology of current weaponry. So there you have a cutaway drawing of the de Havilland Mosquito, the light bomber, constructed almost exclusively, as you can see, of wood. Anyone who remembers the striking images presented in British comics of the 1950s and 60s, particularly the eagle and girl, will recognise at least one of their origins in these products of the MOI. All forms of popular cultural image making were called upon and used, including the Hollywood treatment of the British royal family. Here, for instance, is the Princess Elizabeth, our current Queen, represented as a Hollywood starlet with a cap at a jaunty angle. Less sensational, but no less significant, were the condensed and photographically reduced weekly editions of the Times and Disciple, printed on Oxford India paper, so light and easy to carry, and distributed in about 10,000 copies each per month. The MOI was determined not only to distribute globally, but to recognise that different regions and different countries had different needs and different audiences. And the following sequence shows a number of different sorts of publications aimed at very, very specific markets. Here, for instance, is a pamphlet on Hitler's war on the Catholic Church, clearly directed at a very large and influential audience of Roman Catholics. Here we have African audiences targeted. Victory is vital. Germans would rob West Africans of their produce. Germans would treat West Africans brutally, and Germany would make West Africans into slaves. There was the Arabic audience. This for children, Johnny and Ahmed. They have a series of this. There's obviously, there's Johnny and there's Ahmed, and surrounded by allied figures. They have a series of adventures, clearly, again, to convey to children in Arab-speaking countries the values, the humanity of the Allied cause, as opposed to the inhumanity of the Axis powers. It could be very blank and straightforward, such as this prose account of volunteers from Era serving with the British forces who have won distinctions, clearly directed to the Republic of Ireland, and suggesting quite properly the number of volunteers coming from that country to fight for the Allies. Persia actually had a cartoon adapted from a traditional Persian illustrated tradition where you have the wicked vizier, Hitler, sleeping but uncomfortably dreaming of the three allies that are riding to his destruction, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill with the inevitable cigar. So there's this, as it were, graphic sensitivity, a sense of directing a particular sort of publication within a particular graphic convention to the appropriate market. And these audiences were to be informed not simply by printed pamphlets and newspapers. Substantial sets of beautifully produced photogravures were distributed, and sets of picture postcards were printed in long and repeated runs. There's another selection of these extraordinary postcards. Particularly in the countries of the Empire, the MOI aimed to create a sense of mutual obligation. Britain was fighting for common values, hence British tanks and guns guard African homes. The Empire, recognizing this, responded with men and materials, and then Britain in turn expressed its gratitude in print. So we have here a letter from Clementine Churchill, dear friends overseas, thanks for the gifts which you sent out. Signed January 1942. And this was sent to the American Red Cross, British War Relief Society, Canadian Red Cross, and to organizations, dominions, colonies, and generally to North America. In total, something over 91,000 copies. Your bombers in action, thank you, Gold Case. And another thanks, Red Cross ambulance in action, thank you, Ascension Island. So there was a feedback. It was not just feedback loops, as it were, within this country. There was a sense in which you were addressing a global audience, the audience responded, and you, in turn, responded to that audience. There was a sense of a cycle of communication, not simply an announcement sent out, as it were, to the ether. And I think that's tremendously important, the sense of, as it were, the MOI and Britain listening and responding to what comes back. It was not only the content with which the MOI was concerned, but also presentation. It was conscious that in markets both home and abroad, it could not work exclusively through its own publications, however numerous and however attractive. Local newspapers, local magazines from other publishers could also be vehicles if you provided them with readily usable, adaptable images to illustrate the unfolding conflict. From 1942 onwards, the ministry produced a series of maps of various theatres of war, with labels and without labels, but with direction arrows of various sizes, which newspapers could then use to illustrate the latest campaigns. So this is the first of the whole series, MOI Map Service. There are a series of maps that could be simply replicated in various journals and newspapers. Here, concentrating, of course, on the North African campaign. And there you get a remarkable set of the flags of various countries that could then be imposed on those maps to illustrate where the forces were and how they were moving. So the MOIs generate a huge graphic vocabulary that could be used by other publications. Now, the message celebrating the Allies' values and successes could take many forms, and here are a few. Lots of flyers, very small pieces of paper with a simple printed message on them that could be distributed widely, could be hidden easily, could necessarily be dropped from planes. Here, for instance, is the Hippocrates Oath, 13,000 of which were produced in Arabic. And the point is simple. Doctors should and will conform to the Hippocratic Oath, but that's only possible in free countries. In countries that are dominated by Nazi-like ideologies, the Hippocratic Oath is impossible, as it were, to sustain. Here's another flyer about the BBC, about the ways in which you can get hold of the BBC, access it, and what it can do for you. Notice how frequently coloured printing comes in. Again, colour printing is very expensive and tricky, but the MOI and its various printers seem to have no problem printing extensively in colour. Here, sometimes the traditional book format is not the ordinary codex, the standard book we imagine. Sometimes it's in the form of a concertina fold-out pattern. This one designed for the Persian market. 11,000 went to Iran, and another 10,000 generally to Persia, in Persia. They're coloured stickers. Again, using illustrations you could see in postcards. But they're also stencils. This obviously be stenciled on all the parcels being transmitted to the Russian people as they resisted Hitler's invasion. Greetings, British people. And also transfers, using again the same images as you've seen on the postcard. By the early 20th century, offset lithography had made it much easier to print on surfaces other than paper. Commercial printing, of course, on standard food containers, such as biscuits and sweet tins, is a notable example. The image of a printed Huntley and Palmer's biscuit tin, for instance, even crops up in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The ability to print in colour, on metal, and other surfaces, and surfaces that were not flat, allowed the printed image and the text to become ubiquitous. So here's another problem of the MOI. If you just see it, it's a little lapel badge featuring Winston Churchill. And these were distributed in considerable numbers. Churchill's head, 30,000 to Guatemala, and 40,000 to Persia. There we have a series of little lapel badges with the Allied countries, flags, pin flags. There were even model aircraft kits. Model aircraft for the Smyrna Fair in Turkey. No fewer than 5,000 Spitfire kits, 5,000 Wellington bomber kits, 6,500 Lockheeds, and 6,500 Bolton Paul Defiance to a fair in Turkey for the entertainment of Turkey too. It's extraordinary how diverse and flexible and comprehensive were MOI's markets. This was a war fought on almost every front, in which print, paper, and card could be used as a weapon and as a rallying point. Now I'm going to end with just two images, a literary image and a photographic image, both of which return us to the building from which the Ministry of Information operated. The literary image, almost inevitably, is from George Orwell's 1984. In the novel, the Ministry of Information has been transformed into the Ministry of Truth, or mini-truth. I quote, "The Ministry of Truth was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glitteringly white concrete, soaring up, terrace upon terrace, 300 meters into the air." And the photographic image. This photographic image is from an MOI campaign to encourage women to find utility clothing attractive. As part of the campaign, models were photographed on the leads of no doubt Georgian buildings in Bloomsbury, with the enormous pyramidal structure of Senate House looming in the background. The brightly lit pretty girl in the foreground, leaning away from the sombre mass of Senate House in the background, is a powerful, if unintended, emblem. The MOI was not the nightmarish authoritarian institution that Orwell's novel had transformed it into. But in being housed in the second tallest building in London, stained into a darker hue by years of smoke pollution, one could see how its activities and its presence could so easily be converted into such for the purposes of political satire and as a dire warning to the future. During the Second World War, the MOI had a pervasive influence on British society and culture, on how it was conducted, how it saw itself, and on how it presented itself to the rest of the world. The MOI, sandwiched in time between the introduction of mass observation and the coming of the Cold War, introduced something new to British society, the idea of a formal mechanism to regulate and control information. In consequence, it was an inherently ambivalent institution. Its negative side, the threat of an un-British level of state control, could be offset by the MOI's perceived ability to generate a sense of national purpose at a time of an acute crisis. It was a weapon of total war, functioning as part of a civil society. It was accepted but feared, and it did not last much beyond the end of the war. Its influence was felt in its own and many other cultures. Its achievements and its threats were to echo down the decades, and indeed they still reverberate today.